The first detonation hit just before 4 a.m., shattering the suffocating quiet of New Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. It wasn't the sound of thunder or a gunshot. The sound was too thick, too compressed, a focused percussion charge designed to peel metal without drawing undue attention. It hit the secondary basement vault of the First Keystone Bank, situated right on the sluggish curve of the Monongahela River. July 18, 1986. 3:51 nachts. Red emergency lights began strobing across the fog-damp concrete, cutting through the industrialized haze that always clung to the river valley. Three figures, moving with the economical grace of men who had trained for war, not for this, vaulted the low wall. They wore charcoal gray work overalls, Kevlar vests under the fabric, and balaclavas that swallowed their faces. No names, no history, just purpose. They were inside for less than 90 seconds when the unthinkable happened, the accidental obstacle. A rookie security guard, no older than 19, was in the lobby, frozen, his cheap radio crackling. He was breathing through his mouth, the sound rasping over the static. His name, later found on his identification card, was David Owens. He'd barely drawn his service weapon, a heavy .38 revolver, when one of the intruders, the tallest and most precise of the three, caught him in the peripheral sweep of his flashlight. The air went dead silent, the pounding of the alarm suddenly distant. The young officer's hands were shaking so violently that the muzzle of the pistol described small, frantic circles in the air. He tried to speak. "Stop! Don't move," he stuttered, his voice dissolving into a raw plea. The tall intruder, operating purely on reflex honed by years of active duty, didn't hesitate. There was a single, flat crack, a silenced 9mm round that punched through Owen's chest plate, exactly where the ceramic insert should have been. The kid's eyes fluttered wide with surprised finality before he collapsed, the revolver clattering uselessly onto the marble floor. "Damn it, Ethan," one of the others hissed, his voice tight, his body language recoiling from the cold-blooded reality of the killing. "We said no casualties." The killer, Ethan Cole, didn't answer. He was already moving. Time was a luxury they couldn't afford now. The team didn't break stride. Owen's death was a broken promise, a heavy weight, but they moved deeper into the bank, already at the door to the manager's office. The boat was already set to explode at the end of the line. The vault had been breached, the officer had been shot, and now they had to run. They ran faster than they'd ever run before. Subscribe to find out the real truth behind the missing $12 million transfer, who ordered the bank owner's death, and how a desperate father used his father's past to try and save his daughter. Hit the like button if you want to know what happened to Ethan Cole next. Ethan Cole was 35 years old and had the exhausted eyes of a man who slept too little and worried too much. He had spent the last 2 years building a cage of normalcy around himself in New Bethlehem, the kind of forgotten Pennsylvania town where nothing good happened and nothing bad ever seemed to leave. It was a place defined by the ghost of steel mills and the constant, dull roar of the river. He worked as a security consultant for Central Defense, a job that paid respectably, enough for the mortgage on the small, 2-story house, enough for Sarah's car payments, enough for the illusion of stability. But not enough for Lily. Lily, his 7-year-old daughter, was the heart of his world and the source of his constant, grinding fear. Her diagnosis, a rare, aggressive neurological disorder, had torn the threadbare safety net of their middle-class life to shreds. Insurance covered the basics, but the experimental treatment, the one that offered a faint but definite hope, was housed in a specialist clinic in Boston. The cost was a number Ethan whispered to himself in the dark: $320,000. Ethan's marriage to Sarah was a landscape of whispered arguments and sterile silences. Sarah worked double shifts as a nurse, her empathy stretched thin by her job and the constant grief of watching their daughter fade. She saw Ethan as a rock, solid, reliable, and utterly incapable of solving this one crushing problem. Their unspoken contract had been one of perseverance. Now, the contract was nullified by the sheer, brutal arithmetic of medical debt. "We can sell the house, Ethan," Sarah had said one cold November night, her voice flat against the bedroom ceiling. It won't cover it. Sarah, not even close. And then where are we? Living in a motel, while Lily needs comfort, he'd countered, his hand shaking as he took a sip of cold water. The solution, or rather, the desperate and damning opportunity, lay not in the future, but buried in the dust of his father's past. Ethan's father, James Cole, had been a respected branch manager at the First Keystone Bank for almost 20 years before a sudden heart attack took him in 1982. A decent man, a community pillar, or so everyone thought. For years, James Cole's old office, a cramped, wood-paneled study in the basement of the Cole house, had been locked. After his mother finally passed in 1984, Ethan reluctantly went to clean it out. The air in the study was thick with the scent of old paper, pipe tobacco, and secrets. Behind a false back panel in the old roll-top desk, Ethan found a small, worn leather-bound ledger. The ledger wasn't a personal journal. It was an auxiliary bank record, meticulous and terrifying. It detailed transfers, large deposits, and cash movements that never appeared on the official books. Specifically, it outlined a massive, unaudited deposit of $12 million made in the fall of 1982, mere weeks after the original bank owner, a man named Silas Vance, died under mysterious circumstances, officially listed as a car accident. Vance's death had been the trigger. The ledger, written in his father's precise cursive, explained the truth in cold, analytical detail. Vance had been heavily leveraged to the Chicago outfit, a debt secured by the bank's operational liquidity. When Vance died, the bank's controlling partners, a faceless holding company, had authorized the $12 million transfer to a shell account in the Caymans. It wasn't an investment. It was a payoff, an insurance policy to keep the outfit from moving into New Bethlehem's small-town infrastructure. Ethan's father, James, had been forced to handle the paperwork, the cleanup, and the ledger was his silent confession. A secret he carried until his death. The money wasn't the bank's. It was dirty money, laundered through the vault to satisfy a mob debt. And now it sat in a deep, unaudited reserve the new management used as a black fund for special transactions. The vault had been topped up again last quarter, waiting for the next payoff. To Ethan, it was a profound ethical shift. This wasn't theft. It was extraction. The money was already gone, already tainted. If he took it, he wasn't stealing from hardworking people. He was hijacking a corrupt transaction to save his daughter's life. He was giving the banks dirt and honest purpose. The first person Ethan approached was Marcus Mack Allen, 36, a former U.S. Army demolition specialist who now ran a failing auto body shop on the edge of town. Mack was reliable, taciturn, and carried the quiet, unsettling authority of a man who had seen things he couldn't unsee. He was also staring down a crippling debt from a bad divorce and needed a way out of New Bethlehem, permanently. "I need $320,000, Mac," Ethan said, skipping the pleasantries. They were in Mac's office, the air smelling of hydraulic fluid and cigarette smoke. "I need about 50 to keep the bank off my back, and about 200 to vanish," Mac replied, not looking up from a carburetor. "So what are we talking about, Ethan? Your dad's old place? They got cameras now, you know. Good ones." Ethan slid the ledger across the workbench. Mac stared at the final entry, the $12 million transfer, and the accompanying notes about Vance/outfit settlement. "They're moving another deposit next week. Part of the rotation. They use the deep vault for these shadow transactions. They don't report the reserves. Nobody knows it's there but the brass and me. Because of this," Ethan tapped the ledger, "it's a reclamation, Mac, not a robbery. The money is blood money, and I need it to save Lily." Mac closed the book slowly. The silence was heavier than the tools hanging on the wall. "Lily is the only reason I'm not walking out that door," Mac finally said. 320, clean. The rest gets split 2 ways. 3 ways, Ethan corrected. The third man was Jesse Vargas, 34, a brilliant but chronically underachieving former electrician who specialized in industrial security systems. Jesse was the one who could read blueprints like sheet music and defeat alarm sensors with a coat hanger and sheer arrogance. He also had an old score to settle with the First Keystone Bank, which had foreclosed on his grandparents' farm during the 1970s recession. You're talking about my grandfather's debt to the man who paid off the mob, Jesse said, his eyes glittering behind his perpetually oil-stained glasses. He was the most volatile of the three, driven by a deep, working-class resentment. I'm in, but I get the systems. You and Mac handle the hard perimeter. For the next 2 years, the heist was an obsession. It was less a plan and more Second Life. Ethan used his security consultant access to get high-resolution copies of the bank's updated schematics, a job he had been hired to do. He studied the reinforced concrete, the air vents, the drainage lines, the exact delay timing on the vault's time lock mechanism. He practiced his approach every night on an intricate cardboard model built in his locked basement study. He watched the guards' shift changes, tracking the exact minute David Owens, the young kid, started his graveyard shift. Every detail was mapped, every variable accounted for, including the weather. They needed fog and rain to hide Mac's customized boat approach from the river dock. The emotional weight of the preparation was devastating. Ethan became distant, clinical. Sarah thought he was just overwhelmed by Lily's illness. He couldn't tell her the truth, that he was spending his weekends preparing to become a killer, sacrificing his soul for his daughter's chance at life. The weight of his father's complicity in the dirty money grew heavy, giving Ethan a perverse sense of inherited justice. One final meticulous detail his father's ledger had contained: a hidden ventilation shaft access key, a master key for the old-style maintenance tunnels beneath the original 1950 structure. This was the only way past the motion sensors and into the secondary vault room without a massive perimeter breach. 2 weeks before the planned date, August 1st, Ethan received the final piece of the puzzle and the final push. He was waiting in his car outside the hospital, staring at Lily's window, when his old payphone, a relic he used only for business, rang. He picked it up. The voice was rough, low, and completely unfamiliar, laced with an old-school New York or Chicago accent. The kind of voice that demanded attention through sheer, icy control. "Cole, you've been reading your dad's book, haven't you?" Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter. What matters is the rotation. The next payoff, the one you're counting on, the $12 million transfer, it's being moved up. Thursday, July 18th. Internal audit next week. If you can clean up your old man's mess, you move now. You wait, and it disappears forever. And if you ask who I am again, you won't have a chance to save that little girl of yours." The line clicked dead. It wasn't a warning. It was a deadline set by an unseen hand who knew everything. Someone knew about the ledger, about the money, and about Lily. The plan that had taken 2 years to meticulously craft had just been compressed into 72 hours. The slow, methodical descent had just become a terrifying, unplanned freefall. The crime scene was a masterpiece of professional violence. By 8 a.m., the humid Pennsylvania morning was thick with the stink of wet concrete, spent explosives, and something sourly bureaucratic: the fear of middle management. Leading the response was FBI agent Frank Miller, a man imported from the Pittsburgh field office. Miller was 58, 3 years past his prime, but with an encyclopedic memory for criminal signatures. He wore a tweed jacket that looked too heavy for the weather and moved through the bank's shattered remnants with a heavy, skeptical gait. "Amateurs don't hit a secondary vault with a shaped charge," Miller observed, kneeling beside the vault door. The metal was peeled back in a crescent, not shattered. That's military work. Precise. They knew exactly where to place the load to avoid structural collapse, but still maximize the breach. The local police chief, a nervous man named Doyle, sweated through his uniform. "We found the guard, Agent Miller. David Owens, 19, shot through the vest." Miller walked over to the lobby. The pool of blood around David Owens was a deep, damning stain on the Italian marble. Miller ignored the blood and focused on the wall. He found the slug embedded high in the plaster, retrieved by the forensic team. 9mm, suppressed. "High velocity," Miller murmured, running a gloved thumb over the scored metal. "The entry hole is tiny. They weren't using standard police rounds, military or specialist hardware, and they used it instantly. No warning shot, no hesitation. The man who pulled that trigger is a professional, or he's absolutely desperate. The bank managers were already forming a tight, terrified huddle in the temporary office space, nervously clutching spreadsheets. They reported the total loss: $87,500 in readily accessible cash, primarily in $50 and $100 denominations. That's it. Miller looked incredulous. You take the time to use shaped charges, breach a concrete vault, risk murder charges for $87,000? That money is petty cash in Pittsburgh. That's all that was reported missing, sir, stammered Mr. Henderson, the acting branch manager, his face pale and clammy. The main safe was untouched. The secondary vault just held excess liquid cash reserves. Miller fixed him with a stare that had dissolved a dozen alibis. Mr. Henderson, if I'm going to spend 3 months of my life tracking down a professional crew that used military explosives and a suppressed weapon, that crew is not after pocket change. You're lying. What else was in that vault? Henderson swallowed hard, glancing at his colleagues. The truth about the $12 million offshore settlement fund was a secret they were paid handsomely to keep. Exposing it meant exposing the bank's mob ties, which was far riskier than a simple robbery cover-up. There was a private ledger, Mr. Miller, an old one, belonging to a former manager, James Cole. It contained sensitive internal notes. That's all. James Cole. Miller filed the name away, a tiny thread leading back 4 years. The critical evidence wasn't the money, but the method of entry. Jesse Vargas's expertise had left no trace of forced entry on the main system. The crew had used a rarely used maintenance shaft, a detail only an insider could know. The forensic team reported that the heavy steel access plate leading to the shaft showed signs of being opened with an old, high-quality master key. Miller pulled the personnel files on the late James Cole, the former manager, and discovered the man had died suddenly in 1982. Miller then looked at the current security consultant, Sentinel Defense. The name on the contract was Ethan Cole, the son. The connection was too clean. Father worked there, kept secrets, died. Son got a security contract, learned the layout, and had access to a master key his father presumably kept. Miller ordered a full trace on Ethan Cole, along with Mac Allen, the man who ran the auto shop on the river, perfect for boat access, and Jesse Vargas, the known disgruntled former employee of the bank's victims. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting too neatly, suggesting a simple, revenge-driven insider job. But the 9mm bullet still bothered him, and the overkill precision. While the manhunt for the 3 former locals began, Miller returned to the social commentary of the crime. New Bethlehem was a husk of a town, its industry gutted, its economy run by whispers and debt. This bank wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of where all the money went, to Pittsburgh, to New York, and apparently to the Chicago outfit. Miller settled into a dim motel room, opening a worn notebook labeled Cold Cases. He needed motive. Pure greed didn't align with the extreme risk and the precise theft profile. He ordered his team to dig deeper into the bank's history, focusing on Silas Vance's death in 1982 and the subsequent $12 million wire transfer that Henderson had lied about. 2 days later, the wire trace came back, incomplete but suggestive. A massive off-book transfer had indeed occurred in 1982, routed through a complex series of shell corporations before vanishing. The transfer had been authorized by a mid-level accountant named Arthur Rourke, who now lived quietly in a retirement community outside Scranton. Miller drove 4 hours that afternoon, trading the humid river valley for the sterile air of a Pennsylvania retirement home. Rourke, now frail and tired, was initially resistant. Vance? He drove off a bridge, Miller. Heart attack. End of story. The outfit, Arthur. Tell me about the $12 million payoff. Tell me about the reserve vault they hit last week. Tell me what James Cole's ledger actually said. Rourke finally broke, not out of fear but fatigue. He confirmed the payoff, confirming Ethan's ledger was accurate. It was hush money, to keep the vultures away after Vance died. But the money came from Vance's private portfolio, money he'd skimmed over the years. It wasn't the bank's assets. It was dirty money, Miller. Tainted from the start. Rourke also provided a critical, startling piece of information. After Vance died, his son, Caleb Vance, inherited nothing but debt. He was convinced the bank killed his father to cover up the mob deal. He was obsessed. He used to hang around the bank, asking questions. Caleb Vance, a fourth man, not in the heist, but in the shadows. Miller immediately pivoted the investigation. Caleb Vance was 38, a systems analyst, and had a history of nonviolent, anti-establishment activities. He wasn't a killer or a thief, but he was driven by inherited trauma. He was the ghost Miller had felt hovering over the case. Miller found the phone booth Ethan Cole had used outside the hospital, the one where the chilling deadline call had been placed. The booth was grimy, but the FBI technicians found a small piece of evidence caught in the coin slot mechanism. A tiny slip of paper with a perfectly typed single word, audit. Caleb Vance hadn't robbed the bank. He had orchestrated the timing of the robbery to force the bank's hand. He knew the bank was planning an internal cleanup audit on August 1st to zero out the Special Reserve Fund. By forcing the heist to happen on July 18th, Caleb ensured the money would be stolen before it was officially moved, creating a paper trail of a robbery that the bank couldn't easily cover up. He wanted the secret of the mob money and his father's true fate to be exposed through the sheer, inescapable scandal of the theft. Caleb Vance was the informant who knew about Lily. He hadn't threatened the girl. He had simply used Ethan's desperation as the perfect lever. He had vanished right after the call, having played his final card. Miller felt a sudden, profound shift in the case. This wasn't a heist for simple greed. It was a contract fulfilled by a desperate man, Ethan, and timed by a vengeful man, Caleb, to serve a higher, darker purpose: justice through exposure. Miller called Sarah Cole into the station. She was defiant, exhausted, but loyal. "Where is he, Sarah?" Miller asked, his voice low and devoid of threat. "I haven't seen him since Wednesday night. He went to work. He never came back," she whispered, her eyes red. Miller knew she was lying. He didn't care. He laid out the medical bills for Lily spread across the table. The $320,000 quote from the Boston clinic clearly highlighted. "He needed exactly this much, Sarah. He took exactly this much. The crew only took the amount needed to cover their debts and fund this trip to Boston, plus expenses. They didn't touch the rest of the $12 million. What?" Sarah looked at the bills, then at the table, then up at Miller. She saw not an FBI agent, but a tired man who understood the crushing reality of their lives. She broke down, the silent composure finally snapping. "It was for Lily, the treatment," she choked out, unable to say more. Miller nodded, accepting the simple, brutal truth of the motive. He now believed the case was closed. Desperate father, 2 accomplices, insider information, and a focused amount of money taken to fund a specific medical need. He sent out the APB, painting Ethan Cole as the calculated, tragic thief who had turned to murder for his family. He had his 3 targets. He had his motive. He was missing Caleb Vance, the puppet master, but Miller assumed Caleb had merely done his part and fled. Miller closed his notebook, writing in heavy black ink. Motive: familial necessity / theft amount, precise. He had simplified the case for the media and the Bureau. The official narrative was sealed. 3 greedy men from a dying town tried to get rich. The only thing that didn't fit, the ghost of a question that lingered, was the identity of the person Ethan's father had been afraid of, the silent partner in the shadows who had made the initial call and known about the audit. Miller had solved the who and the why, but he felt profoundly uneasy. He had the money and the suspects, but he was missing the true root of the poison. He looked at the official bank report, which still omitted the $12 million. The bank had won. Their secret was safe, buried beneath the headline of David Owen's death. The final part awaits. The true identity of the mysterious caller, the final fate of Ethan Cole, and the social moral of the heist. Agent Frank Miller didn't like clean endings. They rarely happened outside of bad television. For all the precision of the robbery and the clear motive of familial necessity, the cold professionalism of the killer's first shot, the execution of David Owens, and the strange, taunting deadline call still hung over the case like a persistent odor. Ethan Cole, Mac Allen, and Jesse Vargas were ghosts. Their small fishing boat, found abandoned upriver near a state park, was clean. The $320,000 was gone, converted immediately into cashier's checks. The trail ended in a Greyhound station parking lot. Miller was back in the dim office of his motel, staring at the old ledger James Cole had kept. If Ethan had successfully saved his daughter, he was a murderer living on borrowed time. If he was caught, he was a dead man walking. The only person left to find was the conscience of the crime, the motivator, Caleb Vance. Miller used Caleb's systems analyst background to trace any activity around the date of the audit. He found one anomaly. A single, low-frequency transmission bounced off an obsolete radio tower near the old Vance family estate, a decaying property on the edge of the same bridge where Silas Vance, the original bank owner, had supposedly died. Miller drove out at midnight. The air was thick with mist, muffling the sound of the Monongahela River. The bridge was a rusted spine of iron, and the old Vance house stood sentinel above it, dark and silent. He didn't find Caleb inside the house. He found him in the old pump house by the riverbank. It was converted into a small, makeshift office, powered by a sputtering generator. Caleb Vance wasn't running. He was waiting. He had left one final transmission running on a crude computer, looping a single message. The man who had orchestrated the heist to expose the bank was dead. Caleb had taken his own life an hour earlier, leaving behind a brief, analytical note on the screen, a quiet ending to a life defined by inherited obsession. Caleb's final entry, screen grab. They won. The bank won. The outfit won. I forced the theft early, but Henderson still covered the main transaction. They'll just report the small loss and call Cole a disgruntled local. The ledger will never be seen, but the truth remains. Next to the computer was a worn, water-stained shoebox. Inside, Miller found what the bank managers had denied existed. Not the $12 million wire trace, but the actual, final instructions from Silas Vance's lawyer to his son Caleb, dated a week before the car accident. Silas Vance hadn't died of a heart attack. He had been given a choice: face imminent federal prosecution for massive fraud or disappear. The $12 million payoff to the outfit was a cover story. It was Silas Vance's exit fund, laundered through the outfit's channels by his accountant, Arthur Rourke, and his close associate, James Cole. Ethan's father, James Cole, was not the reluctant cleanup man. He was Silas Vance's complicit partner in the initial embezzlement, splitting the skim profits and helping set up the exit fund. James Cole had kept the ledger not out of confession, but out of insurance. He feared Vance would expose him from his exile, and he feared the outfit, who had been used as pawns in the laundering scheme and knew too much. James Cole's sudden death in 1982 was a heart attack brought on by the crushing fear of being found out by the mob or the feds. The man Ethan had idolized, whose memory he was trying to vindicate, was part of the sickness. The money Ethan stole wasn't blood money stolen from a bank. It was money stolen by his own father years ago, now cycling through the bank's black accounts. The realization hit Miller with the cold precision of the 9mm bullet. Caleb Vance hadn't wanted justice for his father, Silas. He wanted justice for his father's betrayal by James Cole. The entire heist was a multi-generational tragedy built on layered lies. Lie 1. Silas Vance died innocently. Truth. He fled and vanished. Lie 2. James Cole was a victim of the bank/mob. Truth. He was an active embezzler. Lie 3. Ethan was reclaiming justice. Truth. He was covering his father's tracks and securing his own fortune, culminating in murder. Miller picked up Caleb's cassette tape, tucked beneath the shoebox. It was labeled Owens. He played it on the generator-powered deck. It wasn't Caleb's voice. It was the same rough, icy voice from Ethan's phone call. The New York accent. It was never about the audit, Ethan. That was bait. It was about the name. Your father was a good accountant, but a terrible partner. You should have known better than to trust Silas Vance's exit strategy. That $12 million wasn't hush money. It was the price of silence. The voice paused, a chilling, almost affectionate sigh. I was his contact. I was the one who helped him disappear. And when he went quiet, I had to be sure no one would look for him or his partner. I had to guarantee that ledger stayed buried. Your little heist did that perfectly. The bank will cover the rest. You saved your daughter, Cole, but you took my money to do it. You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life, son, and your father won't be there to save you. The mysterious caller wasn't Caleb Vance. It wasn't Sarah. It was the original outfit contact, the one who actually controlled the flow of the $12 million. Viewing Ethan's desperate move as a convenient disruption that wiped the board clean of old players and old records. The APB on the three men remained active, but the trail went utterly cold. 6 months later, Lily Cole received the experimental treatment in Boston. Sarah stayed with her, sending brief, unsigned postcards to a post office box in Montana, the only sign she was alive. Ethan Cole was alive, a ghost somewhere between the Canadian border and the West Coast, working cash jobs, the weight of David Owen's death a permanent anchor around his neck. He had the money to save his daughter, but he had lost his daughter, his wife, and his own name in the process. The First Keystone Bank received a quiet, confidential bailout from the holding company, citing unforeseen losses due to local crime. Henderson retired early, relocating to Florida. The $12 million discrepancy was successfully erased from the internal records, filed away as an unsolved case, a footnote in the history of local crime. The community forgot David Owens almost as soon as the reward posters came down. The social commentary of New Bethlehem was brutal. The desperation of the working class had been successfully exploited by the cynicism of corporate greed and organized crime. The moral disease that killed Silas Vance and poisoned James Cole had simply been passed on to the next generation, forcing Ethan to commit the ultimate sacrifice for a corrupted prize. Miller eventually retired. He never published the full findings from Caleb Vance's pump house. The story was too ugly, too convoluted, and too damning to the institutions he once served. The file on the Keystone Heist sat on a federal shelf, marked inactive, suspects at large. He often looked at the file photo of Ethan Cole, the eyes of a desperate man, and remembered the small, typed slip of paper found in the phone booth. Audit. It hadn't been a warning. It had been the final, surgical command of a powerful, unseen force, turning tragedy into convenience. Sometimes Miller thought about David Owens, the 19-year-old kid who died for $320,000 intended for an experimental drug that may or may not work. In New Bethlehem, the real crime wasn't the robbery, it was what they were stealing the money back from.